Some people confuse confidence with competence. It's our job to remind them of their place. That is what Dr. Caldwell said 48 hours before his medical license was permanently revoked. Cedar Creek Medical in Savannah smells like industrial antiseptic and bitter coffee, the kind that sits in the break room carafe until noon, then develops a burnt aftertaste that nobody mentions because complaining means admitting the hospital runs on fumes and cost-cutting. Natalie Hayes moves through the cardiac wing with a kind of invisible efficiency that makes her dangerous in a way no one has yet recognized. Her scrubs are faded navy blue, worn at the elbows from 18 months of leaning against supply cart edges during rounds. Her badge photo is 3 years old, blonde hair pulled back, eyes direct, the kind of institutional ID that no one actually looks at. She moves past the nurse's station at 18:47 hours, and her presence registers like a shadow crossing a light source, noticeable only because the room got slightly darker. Dr. Caldwell stands in the observation gallery of the surgical wing, his coat pressed with the kind of precision that signals a man who believes fabric discipline reflects moral discipline. He is 53 years old, chief of cardiothoracic surgery at Cedar Creek for 11 years, and his departmental rankings depend on maintaining strict hierarchical boundaries like a dam holds water. Around him stand four residents in white coats, their notebooks open, their attention locked on him the way students learn to lock their attention on gods of institutional power. He speaks without looking at his audience because men like Caldwell don't need to confirm attention, they assume it the way empires assume compliance. Confidence without credentialing, he says, is precisely what destroys patient outcomes and corrupts departmental metrics. His voice carries the weight of someone who has never been questioned by anyone with institutional authority to question him. We are the stewards of this hospital's reputation. That means enforcing boundaries. It means reminding people of their lane. One resident, younger, maybe 26, with dark eyes and the careful posture of someone still learning which words get you promoted, makes a note. Caldwell notices, nods slightly. The gesture means everything to that resident. The gesture means Caldwell approves of his obedience. Natalie passes them. Caldwell doesn't watch her go, but his eyes track her movement in the periphery. That is the mark of a man who sees challenges to his authority as problems requiring solutions. Room 314 sits on the eastern corridor of the cardiac wing, and the light coming through its window at 1900 hours is the color of old honey, warm and stagnant. Inside that room, Commander James Redford lies in a hospital bed positioned at 30 degrees, his chest bare except for monitoring leads that rise and fall with each breath. He is 61 years old. His medical chart is 17 pages long, what Natalie counted while standing at the medication dispensary earlier, her hands moving with the automatic precision of someone who has counted everything that mattered in the dark. Redford's history reads like a casualty report condensed into clinical language: 3 tours, 2003 to 2011, Baghdad and Mosul primarily, with a secondary rotation through Fallujah when a unit needed reinforcements. The shrapnel entered his thoracic cavity during a compound assault in Mosul, right side, fragmentation scattered across what the radiology report calls multiple anatomical structures of significant concern. The larger piece lodged 2 millimeters from his right atrial wall. The smaller pieces migrated over 15 years, following the slow gravity of his own biology, until one of them shifted into a position that crushed his pericardial sac, the membrane holding his heart like water held in a cup. His heart stopped draining properly. Blood backed up. Pressure accumulated. Late-stage cardiac tamponade. The body beginning its slow closure of operational systems. 15 different doctors had reviewed Redford's case in the 18 hours since his transfer from Naval Medical. Natalie knows this because she read each consultation note, each one written in the particular voice of institutional abdication. Not a candidate for traditional surgical intervention. Palliative care recommended. DNR status appropriate given complexity and comorbidities. They had written these things the way men write things when they have already decided someone is not worth saving. She watched them file past his room like priests deciding which corpse deserved prayers. 15 of them. The number sat in her chest like a stone. Redford's eyes are closed when she enters. His breathing is shallow, the kind of breathing that comes when the body is running at a deficit. The ventilator hisses its mechanical rhythm beside his bed, steady and inhuman. Natalie moves to the bedside without announcing herself. She checks the 4 lines, 2 of them, standard saline drips, nothing more sophisticated. She checks the catheter output in the collection bag beneath the bed. The urine is dark amber, concentrated, the color of dehydration and organ stress. She makes 3 notes in the physical chart using a pen that clicks so softly it barely makes a sound. Most nurses use it to announce their presence. Natalie uses silence the way military personnel use camouflage. She is about to leave when Redford's eyes open. They are the kind of eyes that have seen things that cannot be unseen. Pale blue, the color of winter sky seen from a compound wall. They focus on Natalie with the directness of someone trained to assess threats and opportunities with the same weighted attention. He doesn't speak. Neither does she. The moment lasts exactly 4 seconds, long enough to register as something other than accidental eye contact, short enough to avoid explanation. When his eyes close again, Natalie has already turned toward the door. The medication dispensary is at the end of the corridor, past the break room where Caldwell sometimes stands near the window, watching the parking lot the way commanders watch terrain. Natalie pushes her badge against the scanner at 1943 hours. The machine beeps, 2 soft sounds, like a heart monitor registering normalcy. The cabinet slides open with the precision of pharmaceutical security systems that cost more than some people's annual salary. Inside, organized in rows of labeled drawers, sit medications sorted by indication and controlled status. She reaches for a drawer marked cardiac support, diuretics. Her left hand trembles very slightly. Not fear. Not nervousness. Restraint. The trembling is what happens when someone trained for combat operations must perform civilian tasks within civilian constraints. When someone must be smaller than they are designed to be. She withdraws 2 500 milliliter bags of 0.9% sodium chloride intravenous solution, fluids technically reserved for attending physicians to authorize, especially when used for advanced fluid management protocols in cases other physicians had already deemed unsuitable for intervention. She places them carefully in the medication pod attached to her waist. No one sees her do it. That is not luck. That is skill. What happened next could have destroyed everything. Dr. Caldwell stood at the nurse's station when Natalie approached the charting terminal. He wasn't there by accident. He had positioned himself at the exact angle where he could observe both the medication dispensary and the corridor leading to room 314 without appearing to watch either one. Arms crossed. His expression arranged into the kind of professional interest that powerful men deploy like weapons. He watched Natalie move from dispensary to chart to room 314 with the methodical attention of someone cataloging evidence. He did not intervene. Not yet. Intervention came later. What Dr. Caldwell was doing at this moment was building the narrative infrastructure that would allow him to paint what she was doing as recklessness, as scope violation, as precisely the kind of professional overreach that justified hierarchical correction. He was a man who understood that power depends on controlling the story before the story can control the outcome. Behind him, on the department bulletin board, Cedar Creek's surgical metrics were posted in glossy printed font, cardiothoracic outcomes, Q for 2024. Success rate, 94.2%. Readmission rate, 3.1%. Mean patient satisfaction, 4.7, 5.0. Caldwell's signature appeared at the bottom of that document in blue ink. Those numbers were his institutional authority. They were the proof that his hierarchical enforcement worked. A patient like James Redford, refused by 15 physicians, assigned to palliative care, slated for the hospital's mortality statistics rather than its success metrics, could only threaten those numbers if someone tried to save him. Caldwell had built his reputation on the absolute certainty that some people were unsalvageable. If Natalie Hayes proved otherwise, if she saved someone he had already written off, it would create a problem that no amount of institutional power could easily resolve. The rain started at 2,107 hours, hammering the ER windows like applause, and Natalie was inside room 314 checking Redford's catheter output again when her phone vibrated silently in her pocket. The message was encrypted, routed through a secure DOD network, and it contained exactly 7 words: diversion activity spike. 3 packages flagged. Continue surveillance. She did not acknowledge the message. She simply read it, committed the details to memory, and deleted the thread. The Coast Guard commander slept in his hospital bed, his heart struggling against the weight of 15 years of shrapnel and the immediate pressure of the pericardial sac that was slowly crushing it. 13 doctors remained on staff in Cedar Creek's cardiac wing. Dr. Caldwell had already begun making phone calls, casual conversations with colleagues about departmental standards and the importance of maintaining professional boundaries. The machinery of institutional power was beginning to move. But Natalie had been trained by the United States Navy to operate in environments where that machinery was far more lethal than anything Cedar Creek Medical could produce. She had survived worse than this. She had survived things that would have broken people who possessed only civilian credentials. What she didn't know yet was that the worst part hadn't even begun. Tuesday morning came with the smell of antiseptic and the particular silence of people pretending not to listen. Dr. Caldwell stood in the surgical wing observation gallery with 12 residents clustered around him like iron filings drawn to a magnet. His voice carried the practiced authority of a man who had never been questioned. He gestured through the glass partition toward room 314, where Natalie Hayes moved with a kind of economy of motion that came from muscle memory older than her civilian credentials. That, Caldwell said, is an example of how ego eclipses protocol. The residents turned in unison. Natalie didn't look up from Commander Redford's chart. Her pen continued its careful notation. Vital stable. O2 sat 94% on room air. Cardiac markers trending down. The work of someone who had learned to heal in places where ego got people killed. Nurse Hayes believes, Caldwell continued, his voice carrying the weight of professorial contempt, that 20 years of medical school, board certification, and surgical fellowship can be replaced with, what exactly? Good intentions? Nurse's intuition? She's overstepped her scope of practice exactly 47 times in the past 36 hours. I've been counting. One resident laughed. Then another. It was the kind of nervous laughter that happened when a superior gave you permission to mock someone safer to dismiss. Caldwell smiled. The smile of a man whose institutional power was so complete he could broadcast cruelty through an open microphone and call it education. She's got Florence Nightingale syndrome, a resident whispered, loud enough for the intercom to carry it into room 314. Loud enough to be deliberate. She thinks she knows better than we do. Natalie's hand paused for exactly 1 second. Then it moved again. Chart notation. Precise. Unhurried. Her jaw tightened. The muscle at her temple flickered once, then stilled. Anyone watching would have seen control. Anyone watching would have been wrong about what that control was restraining. Caldwell dismissed the residents 20 minutes later with instructions to review the chart notes and identify the nursing protocols Hayes has violated. As they filed out, he remained at the glass, watching Natalie adjust the commanders for drip with the focus of someone performing surgery. She was good. That was the problem. If she had been merely competent, Caldwell could have written her off as delusional. But competence threatened hierarchy. Competence suggested that structure itself might be negotiable. The medication dispensary sat in a supply corridor 2 floors down, accessible only to nurses with proper credentialing. At 1,430 hours, Natalie pushed through the secure door, her badge already in hand. The corridor was empty except for the fluorescent hum that seemed to vibrate at the frequency of institutional indifference. She scanned her credentials. The system beeped. Access granted. Her hands trembled. It was the first time in 18 years that her hands had betrayed her. 18 years of combat zones. 18 years of learning to make hands steady while rounds impacted tile 3 meters away. 18 years of keeping her breathing regulated while the person she was supposed to protect bled into the dust. And now, in a beige corridor in Savannah, Georgia, standing in front of a medication dispensary, her hands were trembling because a man in a $1,000 suit had humiliated her in front of 12 people who would repeat his words until they became institutional truth. She closed her eyes. Her jaw clenched so tightly her molars ached. Her back teeth ground together with the intensity of someone trying to keep something very dangerous locked behind them. The tremor in her hands was not fear. It was restraint. It was 18 years of training converting humiliation into kinetic potential. It was the knowledge that if she let herself respond to what Caldwell had done, to what he was orchestrating, her entire mission would collapse. Commander Redford would die. 3 more veterans would disappear into the medication diversion pipeline, written off as complications. The morphine ring would continue moving product through Cedar Creek Medical, one grieving family at a time. She opened her eyes. Her hands were steady again. She selected the medication she needed, normal stock rotation, nothing that would flag her access logs. The vending machine at 1,505 hours was more difficult. It was a small thing. A coffee machine in the break room adjacent to the east stairwell. It stood against a wall papered with safety notices and hospital announcements. Natalie selected black coffee, 2,200 calories burned yesterday, 1,800 more to maintain her metabolic baseline. She was inserting her change when 2 residents entered. Male. Early training year. The kind of physicians who were still learning how to broadcast their authority because they hadn't yet understood that true authority didn't need to announce itself. "Did you hear about the nurse playing doctor in 314, the first one said. "She's way outside her lane," the second responded. His voice carried the satisfied tone of someone sharing information that confirmed what he already believed. Caldwell's letting her hang herself. He already called the nursing board. 6 separate violations. I heard him on the phone this morning. Caldwell stood 3 meters away, pretending to read his phone. His timing was too perfect. His position too convenient. The way his shoulders remained motionless while his eyes tracked the conversation. He was allowing this. He was orchestrating it. He was building a narrative where everyone would understand that Natalie Hayes was not a dedicated nurse making difficult decisions in a medical gray zone. She was a dangerous woman who believed she could practice medicine without credentials. Natalie took her coffee and walked past both of them. Her pace didn't change. Her expression didn't register the words. She moved like someone who couldn't hear them, which was infinitely more powerful than moving like someone who didn't care. The second resident continued talking as she passed. Caldwell finally looked up from his phone, making eye contact with her for precisely 2 seconds. Long enough for her to understand that this was personal. Long enough for her to understand that he knew what he was doing. She didn't flinch. The words that might have come out, words that would have ended his career 3 seconds after they left her mouth, remained exactly where they needed to be. Behind her teeth. Behind 18 years of operational discipline. Behind the understanding that true power was what you did when the world was watching and everyone expected you to break. Thursday morning came with new weather. The kind of humidity that turned the Georgia coast into a pressure cooker. Natalie had been awake since for 30 hours, reviewing Commander Redford's imaging one more time. The shrapnel migration was minimal. The cardiac tamponade remained stable at 6 millimeters. He was responding to her protocol modifications. The fluids she had administered, outside her documented scope, using medication she could access but technically wasn't authorized to deploy, were working. Caldwell was waiting outside room 314 when she arrived with his morning assessment notes. "Master Chief Nurse Hayes," he said. His tone was theatrical, almost gleeful. The name was wrong and he knew it was wrong and he was enjoying the wrongness. "I've been reviewing your chart entries. Fascinating documentation for someone so committed to patient care. Almost like you're providing a roadmap for the state nursing board. Security will escort you out the moment you step outside your scope again. I've made sure of it. Backup protocols. Administrative observers. Everything above board." He walked away before she could respond. That was the tactic. Deliver the message. Prevent the response. Control the narrative by preventing dialogue. Natalie stood frozen for exactly 3 seconds. Then she pushed through the door to room 314. Commander Redford was awake, his eyes tracking the monitors with the focused attention of someone trained to read instruments in low-light conditions. She had work to do. The commander had survived 15 doctors saying no. He would survive one more day of yes. She continued her charting. Her hands didn't tremble anymore. Whatever had been loose in the medication corridor had been consciously locked away, filed under the same section of her mind where she kept all the other operational sacrifices. Her voice, when she spoke to the commander, remained soft. Respectful. Exactly what a civilian nurse sounded like when she was following protocols instead of rewriting them. "How are you feeling, Commander?" she asked. "Better. Stronger." His hand moved toward hers. "That stitch pattern you used yesterday." "Just good technique," Natalie said quietly. "We learn from each other." But that wasn't entirely true anymore. The investigation into the medication diversion was deteriorating. Commander Redford's presence at Cedar Creek was supposed to be bait, a high-value military patient that would draw the network's attention. 3 weeks in, and the network was supposed to reveal itself. Instead, there was only Caldwell's institutional power and Natalie's compromised cover and the understanding that in 48 hours, everything was going to change. At 2,100 hours, she prepped the commander for an unauthorized echocardiogram. The portable machine was secured in room 314. The ultrasound probe was clean, calibrated, ready. She positioned him carefully, her hands moving with the distinctive three-point pressure technique that stabilized his chest wall. The technique had a name in military medicine: the Kandahar tension stitch. It was taught at Walter Reed. It was taught to combat medics who worked in places where stabilization meant the difference between a patient living long enough to reach a hospital or dying in the dust. The commander's eyes flicked open. He watched her hands. The precision. The angle. The way she moved the probe with the confidence of someone who had done this in field conditions far more demanding than a climate-controlled hospital room. His voice, when it came, was barely audible. "That's a Kandahar tension stitch. You're a combat medic." Natalie's hands paused for half a second. Not a tremor. Not fear. Just a millisecond where 18 years of compartmentalization became suddenly, catastrophically, incomplete. Then her hands resumed their work. "You need to rest, Commander," she said. He reached for her wrist. His grip was stronger than she expected. 3 weeks of her care had been restoring him faster than any of the 15 doctors who had abandoned him had predicted. Mosul. 2006, Extraction Team. "I know that stitch pattern." She gently removed his hand and placed it back on the bed. "I'm your nurse. That's all you need to know." But that wasn't true anymore. At 2,300 hours, sitting in her car in the parking lot of Cedar Creek Medical, Natalie sent a text to her handler. 3 words that would trigger a review of her cover, her mission parameters, and the timeline for extraction. Patient recognized technique. Cover holding but fragile. The response came 12 minutes later, maintain position 72 hours. Asset arriving to relieve commander. Prep for transition. 72 hours. 3 days. 72 hours to keep Commander Redford alive, to prevent Caldwell from escalating further, and to maintain a cover story that was developing the kind of hairline fractures that came before total collapse. She sat in the dark, hand steady on the steering wheel, and understood that the real crisis hadn't even begun. The 0700 golf game was Caldwell's favorite hour. The course was still soft with morning dew, the fairways empty except for the maintenance crew cutting grass in geometric patterns. Natalie didn't follow him there, she didn't need to. The hospital grapevine carried the details by 0830, whispered through the pharmacy corridor, texted between residents, confirmed by the chief nursing officer's suddenly rigid posture when Natalie passed the administrative wing. Caldwell had called the hospital board president on the 3rd tee. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. By the time Caldwell returned to his office at 0915, every senior administrator at Cedar Creek Medical had received a summary email with the subject line, "Urgent, scope of practice violation, immediate action required." 6 specific protocol violations. Caldwell had listed them like a surgeon reciting anatomy. Unauthorized medication administration without physician order. Performance of procedures outside documented nursing scope, specifically the echocardiogram conducted in Commander Redford's private room, recorded by the nursing station camera, timestamp 2247 hours Tuesday. Verbal countermanding of physician DNR recommendations to a patient with decision-making capacity. 3 instances of administering fluid boluses typically reserved for attending physicians. Administration of vasoactive drugs without a critical care RN license. Direct communication with the Chief of Naval Operations regarding a patient's military service status without proper hospital authorization or patient consent. The email was formatted like a legal brief, every word chosen for maximum institutional damage. The board president, a man who prided himself on liability avoidance, had read Caldwell's email to the hospital CEO within minutes. The cascade was automatic. Unstoppable. By 10:30, the hospital's legal counsel had opened a file. By 10:45, the chief nursing officer had walked into the nursing station where Natalie was charting and asked her to step into a private office. The conversation was 8 minutes long. Natalie was placed on immediate administrative restriction pending investigation. She was not to enter room 314. She was not to provide direct patient care to Commander Redford. She was to cease all unauthorized clinical activities, effective immediately. The chief nursing officer's voice was carefully neutral, a script from HR. She wasn't angry, wasn't advocating, wasn't doing anything except executing the directive that had already been decided 3 administrative levels above her pay grade. Natalie listened with her hands folded, her jaw tight as iron. She didn't defend herself. She didn't explain. She simply nodded and asked, "Am I placed on paid or unpaid leave?" The chief nursing officer glanced at the legal counsel representative sitting in the corner. The lawyer cleared his throat. Paid administrative suspension, pending the outcome of the investigation. The second wave hit the state nursing board at 11:15 when Caldwell's formal complaint was submitted electronically, date-stamped and digitized, creating a permanent record of allegations that could take months to investigate. The complaint detailed the same violations, but in regulatory language designed to activate automatic review procedures. A state investigator would be assigned. Natalie's license would be flagged in the system. Future employers would see this notation. Future hospital credentialing committees would ask questions. The complaint included high-resolution photographs, timestamps embedded in the metadata, of Natalie accessing the medication dispensary, of her approaching Commander Redford's room, of her hands holding medical equipment in positions that suggested active clinical intervention. Caldwell had documented his case with the precision of someone who had done this before. The third wave was the one designed to break her cover completely. The email to the Chief of Naval Operations was sent at 11:55, copied to the hospital CEO, copied to the legal counsel, copied to the director of the Joint Commission for Hospital Accreditation. Subject: Request for personnel verification, credential fraud investigation. The message was crafted with deceptive professionalism. During the course of routine credentialing verification, I have identified serious concerns regarding an individual claiming to be a military veteran. This nurse, Natalie Hayes, has referenced combat medical experience and used techniques inconsistent with standard civilian emergency medical training. She has represented herself as having specialized military credentials during patient interactions, specifically with Coast Guard Commander James Redford, potentially to establish unwarranted patient trust and authority. I am requesting verification from your records. Does a Natalie Hayes appear in active or inactive Coast Guard medical personnel files? What is her documented rank and service record? I am concerned that this individual may be impersonating military personnel to enhance her credibility in a civilian hospital setting, which constitutes fraud and potentially opens Cedar Creek Medical to significant liability if false claims of military service are being used to justify unauthorized clinical procedures. The email was a masterwork of institutional sabotage. It didn't accuse her directly. It posed questions. It raised concerns. It created enough doubt that every layer of the Navy bureaucracy would be forced to respond, to verify, to investigate, to generate reports that would eventually circle back to Cedar Creek Medical's legal department and confirm that yes, this person has falsified credentials, yes, this person has misrepresented their background, yes, this person should be terminated immediately for cause. Natalie stood in the hospital parking lot at 1,200 hours and read Caldwell's email on her phone. The heat was building. Savannah in August felt like standing inside an oven, and the asphalt beneath her boots was already soft enough to leave impressions. She didn't move for 3 minutes after finishing the message. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't accelerate. The compartmentalization held, the same technique that had kept her alive in Baghdad when she was learning to surgically place a chest tube while rounds were impacting 20 meters downrange. Pain is data. Emotions are information. Process them later. But there was no later. There was only this: Caldwell had just activated the Pentagon. He had no idea what he had actually done. The email would route through the Chief of Naval Operations Office, which would delegate it to NCIS, Naval Criminal Investigative Service, which would pull Natalie's personnel file, cross-reference her current location, and notify her commanding officer at DEA-DOD Joint Task Force Intelligence Division that her cover had sustained catastrophic damage. Caldwell had just created a paper trail that connected a civilian nurse named Natalie Hayes to Coast Guard personnel verification requests, which was fine, except that classified operations don't survive government email systems. Everything documented, everything discoverable, everything creating evidence that could be subpoenaed if this hospital case ever went to litigation. The music in her chest started at 12:45. Natalie was sitting in her car, hands on the steering wheel, watching the ER entrance where ambulances came and went in their relentless rhythm. She wasn't crying. Crying was a symptom of loss, and she hadn't lost yet. What she was experiencing was something more precise, the recognition that her mission, 72 hours to identify the controlled substance diversion ring, 72 hours to gather evidence on whoever was trafficking fentanyl through the Coast Guard patient wing, had just been compressed into something measurable in hours. Perhaps minutes. The hospital's legal response would be matched by the Navy's response. Caldwell was competent, methodical, and absolutely convinced he was protecting his institution. He had no idea he was summoning a threat that made hospital rivalries look like children arguing over playground territory. Her encrypted phone buzzed at 1300. Unknown military routing. She answered without speaking. Hayes. The voice was her commanding officer, 3 ranks above her, stationed at the Pentagon. We have a situation. Caldwell's email just flagged our systems. NCIS is requesting clarification on personnel records. Sir, I'm still embedded in the medical facility. I'm still 48 hours from identifying the supplier connection. You're not embedded anymore. You're burned. Hospital's legal counsel is asking naval operations about your service status, which means the investigation into their own staff is about to expand into territory that requires declassification authority. We don't have time for declassification authority. We're extracting you. Natalie watched an ambulance pull into the bay. The lights cut off. The siren stopped. 2 paramedics jumped out and opened the rear doors. Sir, if we pull now, the medication ring continues operating. Another few days, another week of data, and we have names. Suppliers. Distribution channels. And if you stay, your cover gets subpoenaed in a hospital civil lawsuit, your personnel file becomes a matter of public record, and a classified operation gets exposed on the evening news. We are extracting you. 1 hour. Back entrance, loading dockside. Vehicle will be marked for pharmaceutical supply delivery. You walk out in your scrubs, get in the van, we drive you to Savannah International, and you're on a military transport to the Pentagon by 1700. That's not negotiable, Hayes. The line went dead. Natalie sat in her car for 40 seconds and understood that Caldwell had made a catastrophic strategic error. He had tried to destroy her by reaching for institutional authority, not knowing that her institution was infinitely larger than his hospital, infinitely more powerful, infinitely less interested in protecting his career advancement or his liability concerns. What he had done was accelerate a timeline that was supposed to move at intelligence-gathering speed and transformed it into something that moved at military speed. The difference between those two velocities was the difference between a scalpel and a sledgehammer. She needed to see Commander Redford one final time. She needed to tell him something that would make sense later, after the investigation concluded, after his family received the classified briefing about why a nurse had treated him against hospital protocol, after he understood that his shrapnel wounds were connected to something larger than cardiac complications. But she was restricted from entering his room. Caldwell had made sure of that. So she walked to the medication dispensary at 1325, pulled up the staffing system on the computer terminal, and noted that Dr. Caldwell was scheduled to round on cardiac patients at 1400. His rounds took him past the cardiac ICU pharmacy, past the supply closet in the East Wing, past the medication cart stationed in the hallway outside room 314. Past the very spot where Natalie had been standing when she first learned about Commander Redford, the patient no one would save, the officer whom 15 other physicians had decided was already dead. She had 35 minutes to decide if she was going to follow orders or if she was going to act. The monitor alarm in room 314 started escalating at 1342. The monitor alarm in room 314 started escalating at 1342 hours. Natalie heard it from the hallway, not the steady beep of routine decline, but the sharper, faster pulse of acute decompensation. The night resident, Dr. Patterson, a third year whose hands trembled when he wrote orders, emerged from the room reaching for his phone. His fingers moved toward Caldwell's emergency contact before his brain caught up to the danger unfolding. Natalie was already moving. Not running, running drew attention, created noise, invited questions. She walked, the way apex predators move through tall grass. Her badge was still technically active until noon. Her hands were still steady. And in room 314, Commander James Redford's right ventricle was collapsing under the weight of accumulated blood that shouldn't be there, fluid pressing against the heart muscle like a fist closing around a thrashing animal. She pushed past Patterson without breaking stride. Call respiratory. Get a crash cart. Stay out of my way. It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered in a voice that had last been heard giving orders to sailors under fire in Jolan District, Fallujah, 2006. The resident froze, then moved. Fear is a better motivator than protocol. The commander lay grey-white against the sheets, his breathing shallow, his oxygen saturation dropping like a stone down a well. His pupils were blown, his pulse thread thin at his neck. 23 minutes until his heart would stop entirely. 23 minutes before irreversible damage cascaded through his organs like dominoes falling in a wind tunnel. The 15 doctors who had already abandoned him, 15 separate decisions to do nothing, to let this man's chest fill with fluid until he drowned from the inside, had calculated that he was too far gone. They had done their math. They had followed protocol. They had walked away. Natalie had learned pericardiocentesis under conditions that made most doctors' nightmares seem quaint. The compound in Baghdad had been taking mortar fire. She had performed the procedure 32 times in 34 hours, her hand steady while the building groaned around her, while blood pooled on the tile floor, while wounded sailors gasped her name like prayer. Pain is data. Chaos is information. Your hands know what to do if you stop asking permission. She positioned the commander supine, elevated his chest 45 degrees, felt for the angle of his ribs with her fingertips. The landmark was there, second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the junction between flesh and fate. Respiratory burst through the door with the crash cart trailing behind like a bright blue shadow. The technician's name was Marcus, 47 years old, 3 children, had worked the night shift for 18 years without incident. You can't. He started. I can and I am. Mark the time. 1,347 hours. She prepped the needle with one hand while her other hand located the pressure point where the sternum met the breastbone. 14-gauge angiocath needle. The kind that looks impossibly thin until you're trying to find a space between a man's ribs that's maybe 1 centimeter wide. Her breathing was controlled. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way she had been trained by a man named Gator who had spent 31 years extracting living things from dying situations. The needle went in. Angle 50 degrees. Slow advance. The skin gave way like something alive, something that understood it was surrendering. She felt the resistance of tissue, the give of the pericardial sac, the sudden absence of pressure that meant she had reached the space where blood had collected like a verdict. The commander's hand gripped the bed rail, knuckles white, and made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "I know," Natalie said. Her voice was steady. "Breathe." The syringe attached. Dark blood filled the chamber, 47 milliliters, then 63, then 82. Each withdrawal was a life returning to the commander's vessels, each syringe was pressure releasing from around his ventricle, each moment was the difference between a man who would wake and a man who would be a name on a memorial wall in Washington, D.C. The monitor's pitch changed. The rhythm shifted. Sinus rhythm emerged like something being pulled from dark water back into light. O2 sat climbing. 75. 82. 88. His pupils constricting, the grey-white fading from his face, the fingers that had gripped the bedrail now loosening with the return of something like hope. Marcus was staring at her the way people stare at impossible things, birds that shouldn't be able to fly, hands that shouldn't be able to move that precisely, miracles that happened despite all the committees and policies that said they couldn't. "Get 2 milligrams midazolam for sedation," Natalie said. "Core temp is dropping. I need a bear hugger blanket." She was still giving orders. She was still the authority in the room. The mask hadn't cracked yet, but the edges were showing something metallic underneath. By 0800 hours Thursday morning, the mask had been removed entirely. Security met her at the nursing station entrance. 2 of them, professional, unapologetic, carrying the flat effect of men simply executing instructions. "Ms. Hayes, we need you to come with us." Not a request. Just like her command to Patterson, not a request. The difference was that these men had authority from a chain that started in Caldwell's office and extended through the hospital administrator's desk and somewhere up into the legal department where liability had been calculated and found to exceed the value of one undercover nurse's career. Her badge was deactivated at the security desk with an audible beep, a small electronic death, a moment of finality captured in binary code. They walked her to her locker in the nursing break room. The contents had already been removed. Someone, she suspected Caldwell's office assistant, a woman named Patricia who wore her boss's cruelty like borrowed jewelry, had already sorted through 7 years of accumulated identity. The stethoscope. The pen collection. The photo of her daughter Mia at graduation, 19 years old, brilliant, unbending, asking no questions about why her mother had so many secrets. All of it was now in a cardboard box sealed with brown tape that looked like a coffin prepared for something already dead. Natalie carried the box to her car. Nurses whispered as she passed, careful, coded whispers that younger staff would misinterpret as sympathy but which actually contained the ancient calculation of survival, "We are glad it is not us." She made it as far as the parking garage before her hand started trembling. Not from fear. From restraint. The trembling was what happened when a woman who had been trained by military operators to suppress every electrical signal of emotion for 32 years suddenly felt the current building with nowhere to go. She sat in her car in Space 14B, and gripping the steering wheel hard enough that her knuckles turned white, and let the trembling run its course like an aftershock. 5 minutes. That's how long she gave it. Then she drove home. Mia found her at the kitchen table that evening. Still in her scrubs, the fabric dried now, the blood from the pericardiocentesis flaked into small brown fragments on her left sleeve like rust. Her hands were folded flat on the table. Her eyes were fixed on the cardboard box, which she had emptied and left open like a mouth, and from which protruded the tops of a pair of boots that had seen exactly 847 days of active combat, 11 different firing ranges, 3 deployments, 2 wars, and 4 months' worth of hospital rehabilitation at Walter Reed when the shrapnel from muscle had entered her right shoulder and exited somewhere near the core of who she believed herself to be. Mom. Mia was 17 then, or maybe 18, the years had started running together in the way they do when you're living two separate lives in the same body. "Why are you home? What happened?" Natalie couldn't answer. The words existed somewhere in her neural pathways, in the command language she had been using for 15 years, in the medical terminology that had sustained her through 14 hours of emergency operations in forward operating bases that didn't officially exist. But between her brain and her mouth, something had fractured. What came out instead was silence and tears that fell without permission, without explanation, without any of the control that had defined every other moment of her adult life. "Mom." Mia moved closer. She was tall now, taller than Natalie, which still startled her, the way her daughter had grown into someone she didn't entirely recognize. "Talk to me. Please?" Natalie's hands trembled. Not from fear. From loss. From the knowledge that she had failed her mission, failed her commanding officer, failed the investigation into a medical trafficking operation that was still running, still diverting controlled substances, still operating in the spaces between policy and silence that doctors like Caldwell maintained like personal fiefdoms. She reached into the cardboard box and pulled out the boots. They were scarred, scuffed, broken in by terrain that didn't exist on most Americans' maps. The left boot still bore faint traces of a dark stain that would never entirely come clean, Commander Redford's blood from a firefight in 2006 where he had taken shrapnel meant for her, where she had carried him for kilometers through urban warfare while returning fire with one functional arm, where they had both decided without speaking that some bonds transcend military hierarchy or medical licensing or the careful constructed normalcy of civilian life. She held the boots against her chest and finally let the trembling become something else entirely. The rain started then. Not gradually. Savannah rain in October arrives like a decision, like a yes pronounced over and over by the sky itself, hammering against the windows with the insistence of something that has been waiting a very long time to be heard. Mia sat beside her mother at the table, not speaking, not asking, just present in the way young people learn to be present when they finally understand that some things are too large for words. The cardboard box sat between them, empty now except for the scent of shoe polish and combat zones and a mother's career compressed into 14 cubic feet of corrugated fiber. "I'm sorry," Natalie whispered. It was the first time her daughter had ever heard her apologize for anything. Outside, the rain continued. On the streets of Savannah, on the surface of the Savannah River, on the windows of Cedar Creek Medical where Dr. Caldwell was probably reviewing surgical schedules, where the investigation into controlled substance diversion was still running its slow course through bureaucratic channels, where Commander Redford was fighting his way back to consciousness in a hospital bed that he owed to a nurse who had just lost everything to save him. The rain fell on all of it equally, without judgment, without the careful calculations of hierarchy or protocol or the politics of who was permitted to know what truth. Natalie held her boots and let her daughter hold her, and for the first time in 34 years, she was not the one maintaining the mission. The mission, it turned out, had other plans. 3 days later, an Iraqi national arrived at Cedar Creek Medical's emergency entrance with a gunshot wound to the left shoulder, his breathing shallow, his eye scanning the ER bay with the terrified awareness of someone who knew exactly how hospitals worked in war zones. The trauma team was moving, code activation, trauma surgery standing by, the orchestrated chaos that hospitals do better than anyone. But when the Iraqi saw Natalie passing through the corridor in her civilian scrubs, he stopped mid-stride. His whole body went rigid. He looked at her face, at the precise way she moved, at the particular angle of her shoulders as she approached his stretcher, and his voice came out fractured, urgent, almost a prayer in Arabic, then English, Al-Malik al-Azraq. Al-Malik al-Azraq. The Blue Angel. Her battlefield code name. The one she'd buried under 34 years of civilian cover. The ER fell silent. Actual silence, not the ambient white noise of monitors and ventilators, but the kind of silence that happens when the invisible suddenly becomes visible. A security guard stood nearest to the stretcher, a Navy veteran with a beard and salt-stained fatigues visible under his hospital polo. He looked at Natalie, then at the Iraqi patient, then back at Natalie. "Wait. You're telling me this nurse is..." The patient was already nodding, repeating it like a prayer, Al-Malik al-Azraq. "I was Basra, 2009. You pulled 3 of us out. Artillery strike. Burning compound. His shoulder was bleeding through fresh gauze, but his eyes were locked on her with the kind of recognition that transcends language. That's impossible, the attending surgeon said, but he was already backing away from the stretcher, something in the patient's voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. By 11 a.m., a rear admiral stood in Cedar Creek Medical's administrative conference room, his dress uniform pristine as fresh paint, his bearing the kind of military presence that makes institutional authority look small. He wasn't alone. 2 special agents in dark suits flanked him, one opening a laptop, the other holding a manila folder marked with federal seals. The hospital's CEO sat at the head of the table, pale. Dr. Caldwell was there, his posture still trying to project confidence, but his hands were flat on the polished wood, fingers spread slightly, like he was bracing for impact. The rear admiral waited until the room was completely quiet. Then he spoke. Master Chief Hayes was placed at Cedar Creek Medical on a joint DEA investigation into controlled substance diversion. His voice was the kind that had given orders in combat zones, steady and absolute. 4 Coast Guard veterans died under suspicious circumstances in this hospital over the past 18 months. We needed someone embedded in the patient wing. Someone who could provide credible medical cover while identifying the diversion. He turned directly to Caldwell. Your complaint to the Chief of Naval Operations triggered an automatic audit of all military patient files under your care. The legal counsel opened her laptop. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with the finality of someone accessing sealed records. Dr. Caldwell, she said, not looking up, we need to discuss 17 cases. The room's fluorescent lights hummed like insects, relentless, clinical. The first case appeared on screen, a 42-year-old Marine with 3 surgeries under Caldwell's supervision. Marked a successful vascular reconstruction. But the follow-up imaging, the imaging that should have been on file, showed post-operative hemorrhage that Caldwell had coded as pre-existing trauma. The morphine log, 12 units administered on post-op day 3. The pharmacy records, 8 units actually dispensed. The special agent leaned forward. Where did the other 4 units go, Doctor? Case after case scrolled past. A retired petty officer with a complex thoracic reconstruction. Marked complications attributed to the patient's prior injuries, not post-operative negligence. Surgical outcome data falsified to inflate departmental rankings. Fentanyl patches counted as administered to intubated patients who couldn't possibly have used them. The pattern was systemic. The pattern was intentional. The pattern was 17 separate counts of federal fraud. You've been selling unused medications, the CEO's voice cracked slightly on the last word. Caldwell stood up, his chair making a sound like a small animal being stepped on. This is absurd. You demand nothing, the rear admiral interrupted. His voice was quiet. It was the quietest moment in the room, and because of that, it carried more weight than any shout could carry. Federal investigators are in your office right now, securing files. Your medical license suspension has already been filed with the state board. The Board of Medical Examiners will convene Monday morning. The DEA will conduct formal interviews with every pharmacy technician under your supervision. Caldwell's face was the color of old concrete. He looked around the conference room for allies, for someone whose eye he could catch, some institutional lifeline he might pull. The nursing director wouldn't meet his gaze. The hospital legal counsel was typing faster now, documenting everything. The CEO was already making a phone call to the board's chair. And Commander James Redford, who had been brought into the hospital at Caldwell's insistence so he could observe the proceedings, sat in a chair near the window, still pale from infection but alive, and stared at Caldwell with the kind of contempt that only another man who'd survived can deliver. You were going to let me die to cover your tracks, the commander said quietly. Each word was separated from the next like controlled detonations. You restricted Master Chief Hayes from my care. You filed complaints. You contacted the Navy. All because she was getting too close to what you were doing. Caldwell's hands began to tremble. Not from fear, from the realization that trembling wouldn't matter anymore. His carefully constructed network, the board connections, the institutional authority that had protected him for 17 years, the hierarchical respect that allowed doctors to become untouchable, all of it was collapsing in real time, visible in the silence, audible in the sound of keys clicking and federal records being transferred. The morphine diversion ring had a supply chain, and that supply chain led through Cedar Creek Medical, and Cedar Creek Medical's source was Caldwell's pharmacy access, his position, his trusted status. 6 pharmaceutical technicians who had been moving product were already in federal custody. 3 distributors with felony records were facing charges. The quantity of missing medication traced back to 847 doses of morphine and 340 patches of fentanyl over 18 months. That wasn't an accident. That wasn't paperwork errors. That was enterprise-level drug trafficking, and Caldwell was the trusted physician at its center. By late afternoon, Caldwell's office had been sealed. His parking space had his name removed. His access badge no longer opened secured areas. The hospital's public affairs department was already drafting a statement about internal compliance reviews and separation from clinical practice, the kind of language that transforms human failure into administrative reorganization. Caldwell spent the next 6 hours being interviewed by federal agents in a room that wasn't cold, but felt cold, because certainty has weight and uncertainty has none. His medical license suspension became permanent revocation in 30 days. His legal team began negotiations for a plea agreement. His defense would have been competence. He was a skilled surgeon, excellent outcomes on paper, but competence in one thing doesn't excuse criminality in another. The Coast Guard convened its own investigation into how many of his veteran patients had been compromised, how many surgical complications were actually evidence of neglect, how many pain management failures were actually diversions. 6 months later, in the quiet aftermath of conviction and consequence, Natalie stood in room 314 at Cedar Creek Medical in her dress blues. Navy service uniform. The fabric was darker than civilian clothes, more structured, like the uniform itself was a different kind of posture. Master Chief anchors gleamed on her collar, each one representing years of service that had never been visible in the hospital's fluorescent corridors. Commander Redford sat on the edge of his hospital bed, steadier now, his color returning, his breathing no longer labored. The shrapnel was gone. The cardiac tamponade was resolved. The infection had cleared. 34 years of military service, compressed into this moment. "How's the new position?" he asked. "Director of Veteran Patient Services," Natalie said. Her voice was different now, not deferential, not careful, but absolute. "I get to make sure what happened to you never happens again. I get to ensure every military patient at Cedar Creek has an advocate who understands the difference between abandonment and protocol." Through the window, she could see the new chief of cardiothoracic surgery making rounds, a former Navy surgeon who had served in Kandahar, who understood the cost of service not as an abstraction but as lived experience. The change had been immediate and complete. Caldwell's credentials were permanently revoked. His medical license was gone. He had accepted a plea agreement on 5 of the 17 fraud counts, which meant federal prison in 18 months, after appeals were exhausted. In the interim, he was teaching CPR fundamentals at Coastal Georgia Community College for $18 an hour, 45-minute classes, twice a week, to students who often didn't know who he was or what he'd done. The diversion ring was dismantled. 3 distributors were in federal custody. The pharmacy technicians had turned state's evidence. The controlled substance logs at Cedar Creek Medical were now supervised by federal monitors who checked every unit, every dose, every patch. 17 veterans' families were receiving settlement notices for surgical complications that had actually been negligence. The hospital had established a veteran patient advocacy board. Natalie chaired it. Commander Redford stood from the hospital bed, moving with returning strength, and extended his hand. Natalie shook it firmly, military handshake, the kind of grip that says, "Yes, I understand what you survived, I was there when you needed it." "Master Chief, I never properly thanked you," he said. "You would have done the same, sir," Natalie replied. The commander's eyes crinkled slightly. "In Mosul, you told me something while pulling me out of that burning compound. You were bleeding, one arm barely functional, and I was screaming. You remember what you said?" Natalie nodded once. True class is what you do when the lights go out. The commander gestured toward the window, toward Cedar Creek Medical's halls, toward the monitors and the protocols and the new oversight that would protect future service members. You proved it twice. Once in the dark in Baghdad. Once in the light here in Savannah. And both times it cost you. As Natalie walked through Cedar Creek Medical's corridors that afternoon, nurses straightened when she passed. Not in the old way, not deferential, not intimidated, but in the way people stand when they recognize authority earned through action rather than position. The trauma team nodded. The residents moved aside. The attending physicians in the surgical wing exchanged glances that said, "That's the one who brought down Caldwell." In her new office, Natalie had placed a shadow box on the wall. Her combat boots sat inside it, preserved under glass, cleaned carefully but never pristine, because authenticity means the stains of service remain visible. One of the boots still bore traces of the commander's blood from that night in Baghdad when she'd extracted him from the burning compound with one functional arm and the kind of determination that doesn't stop until the mission is complete. The boots were no longer hidden. They were displayed. They were the proof that some people walk among us with stories we'll never fully know, carrying weight we'll never fully understand, doing the work that matters most when nobody's watching and still doing it just as well when everybody is. Subscribe to see more stories like this one, stories of quiet heroism, of mission and cost, of the people we underestimate until the moment comes when they save everything.